The American Legion Department of Connecticut, whose mission is to preserve the memories and incidents of our association in the Great Wars, dedicates their support of this program in memory of our World War II veterans for heroic service for God and country. Learn more about the American Legion at 860-721-5942 or ct.legion.org. With additional support provided by the Lincoln Financial Group.
Thucydides, the funeral oration by Pericles. To me it seems that the consummation which has overtaken these men shows us the meaning of manliness in its first revelations and in its final proof. Some of them, no doubt, had their faults, but what we ought to remember first is their gallant conduct against the enemy in defense of their native land. They have blotted out evil with good and done more service to the Commonwealth than they ever did harm in their private lives. No one of these men weakened because he wanted to go on enjoying his wealth. No one put off the awful day in the hope that he might live to escape his poverty and grow rich. So they fled from the reproaches of men, abiding with life and limb the brunt of battle, and in a small moment of time, the climax of their lives, a culmination of glory, not of fear, were swept away from us.
During World War II, 4,347 men from Connecticut, including many in the flower of their adolescence, were killed in action. More than 1,000 other state citizens, including several women, died of disease, perished in training mishaps and accidents, or committed suicide while in service during the war years of 1941 to 1945. They worked as clerks, dairy farmers, doctors, golf professionals, lawyers, masons, poets, salesmen, teachers, and ushers at local movie theaters, among other jobs. Many were college students gone off to fight with copies of Shakespeare and Shelley in their duffel bags. In war, they perished in every theater, in every battle. Most were ordinary infantrymen, killed in the countryside and cities of Europe and on islands in the Pacific. The others served as sailors who vanished at sea, and airmen whose planes plummeted violently from the skies, disappearing without a trace in some cases. These deep personal losses tempered the victory over Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, and fell entirely upon families and friends from the neighborhoods and hollows of Connecticut, where the dead once lived. The poet Wallace Stevens worked as an insurance executive at the Hartford Insurance Company. He walked each day from his comfortable home in a leafy neighborhood to the office near the city's downtown. During these walks, Stevens framed his analysis of the world. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Stevens shifted his concentration to the crisis in Asia and Europe. The Noble Writer, an essay that covered the world crisis of the period, appeared in February 1941. The world, he wrote, was buckling under the pressure. As the Noble Writer circulated among the nation's literary elite, Stevens' Connecticut neighbors in the National Guard received fresh marching orders from Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt federalized the 169th Infantry of the 43rd Division and ordered them to military camp in Florida. For some of the 8,000 citizen soldiers of the 43rd Division, the order meant the first step toward oblivion on an obscure island thousands of miles from home.
We talked about it all the time amongst the troops, that the war was going on in Europe, and the attitude of most of us was, well, at least if we were going to go, we go with people that we know.
The first peacetime conscription in American history began in 1940. The draft swept Connecticut men from their homes in increasing numbers as the government tightened deferrals. Scattered among dozens of military reservations and camps in the United States, the peacetime conscripts reckoned they would serve their one-year tour of duty and then melt back into civilian life. Germany and Japan built formidable killing machines in the 1930s and attacked neighboring states and traditional enemies with little distinction between soldier and civilian. In Europe, the Nazi onslaught overwhelmed Poland, the Low Countries, and in June 1940, France. Japan's territorial ambitions ranged throughout East Asia and included lands from China to Indonesia. Germany based its technological and tactical development for killing the enemy on generations of research and application of armed strength.
The German Army of World War II was the end product of nearly a century devoted continuously to the exhaustive study of all aspects of the science of war. The overall weapon system was tailored to fit the new tactical doctrine created and taught by the General Staff, a tactical doctrine new in the means by which it would be carried out, but employing every ruse and effect which had been known to succeed in wars through the ages. They called this type of warfare the Blitzkrieg. Penetrate, surprise, shock, encircle, demoralize, and mop up. This was the simple theme. Major James C. Beyer, editor, Wound Ballistics, Medical Corps.
Imperial Japan, meanwhile, tied its contemporary ambitions with historical and psychological links to the warlords of its feudal past.
The Japanese army was built around the foot soldier, just as the armies of the feudal lords of the not-too-distant past. Accordingly, the design of the Japanese weapons featured lightness and mobility. Supporting weapons were specifically designed as aids to the infantry. Tactical doctrine specified that the aim of all battle was for the foot soldier to engage the enemy and completely annihilate him, in offense or defense. The aggressiveness of the feudal warrior was the keynote, even to the extent of the final Banzai raid, when all was hopelessly lost. Major James C. Beyer, editor, Wound Ballistics, Medical Corps.
Whether steel fragments from German artillery or Japanese bullets, grenades, mortars, and later kamikaze attacks, the American serviceman faced a staggering array of weapons designed to shred him to pieces. Once the horror of battle commenced, the serviceman could see with absolute clarity the astonishingly simple calculus of the Second World War. It would take killing on an unimaginable scale to dislodge Germany and Japan from their conquests. And that task would last far beyond the one-year tour that many expected prior to December 1941. The U.S. was at war against Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany within hours of the December 7, 1941 raid by Japanese planes on Pearl Harbor. The consequences were immediate and deadly in the Pacific and in Europe. German U-boats hunted supply vessels such as the Jacob Jones on the east coast of the U.S., sinking dozens of ships. Convoys steaming to England in the North Atlantic also fell under attack from below the sea. In the Pacific, the Japanese military advanced on American positions in the Philippines. In May 1942, Connecticut Governor Robert Hurley dispatched his military aide to personally console the families of Connecticut men lost in the initial attacks.
Clinton, Mrs. Charles G. Jones, small house near the railroad tracks. Father, too old to work. Blind son and a daughter about 17. Mrs. Jones cried a lot. They are very poor. Nothing in the house to eat but bread, donuts, and tea. Son lost on Jacob Jones. Showed me his pictures in his last letter. I telegraphed the Naval Relief Society, Washington, and $25 was sent May 18. Norwich, Mr. Joseph Corto, 72 Boswell Avenue. Both he and his wife are Italian and pretty crude. Crowd gathered at the front door, great excitement in the neighborhood. The mother, tearful, tried to speak. Husband and I talked. Finally, the woman said, "I want my boy back." Suffield, Mrs. Harry L. Taylor, Holloway Avenue. Lives about 2 miles north of the town. Hard to find because she lives with her father. After quite a wait, a lovely girl of about 19 came in and we had a long talk. Father is a prosperous farmer in a good tobacco district, and the house was very attractive. Mrs. Taylor was far from showing any signs of sorrow. She was probably just brave. Meriden, Mrs. Ludwig Orzik, 256 Pratt Street. Went in 256, which was a spaghetti joint that stunk to heaven of rancid olive oil. Woman in the rear cooking said Mrs. Orzik lived in the back. An old, homely Italian woman gave me a wet hand to shake. Her boy was lost on the Arizona. When I told her who I was, she became tearful. She is very poor, but has received 6 months' pay. A beautiful child of 6 stood by. "Is this your baby?" I said. "Yes," she said. "I have 6 left." I was away 4 days, and I'm glad I made the trip, if only to get relief to Mrs. Charles Jones of Clinton. In almost every house I was shown a picture of the deceased sailor. In every home I was thanked for the call, in many, fervently. I covered 515 miles. Lieutenant Commander Nelson Macy, May 16 to 19, 1942.
Edmund Zibkowski of Bristol once taught science to the freshman class at Bristol High School, but now stood in the line of battle in the Philippines.
When he went over there, he says he's going to learn something. He said, something I'll tell my grandchildren about and all this, traveling and seeing so much of the world. He had that in the back of his mind.
He was married and had an infant daughter at home, but the Army needed his engineering skills. The Army called Zibkowski from its reserve rosters in November of 1940 and shipped him out to Asia less than a year later. As the Japanese closed in on the small American force in late March of 1942, an air attack sent shrapnel carving through Zibkowski's back, leaving him mortally wounded. He died on April 2, 1942, Good Friday, the first Bristol man to be killed in action in the Second World War.
I remember walking to church and saying the next prayer, and he was dead. I didn't realize it. But we didn't know that he had died until after Easter.
Thousands attended Zibkowski's memorial service at a church in Bristol later that month.
Leading the march of mourners from the church was Mrs. Helen Zibkowski, the captain's gallant wife, and his vivacious 22-month-old daughter. Moved by the sight of the bravely smiling Mrs. Zibkowski and the child, the entire congregation stood with heads bowed as the pair left the church. Many persons wept unashamedly outside the church as the two, and the deceased captain's parents emerged. The Bristol Press.
Community-wide church services, however, would be rare in the future. The list of the dead simply grew too long. During the First World War, about 700 Connecticut men perished in the 19 months of official U.S. involvement in the conflict. The early tempo and massive geographic scope of World War II triggered fears that the figure for the second conflict would greatly exceed the death toll of the Great War. The Bataan Death March and subsequent imprisonment of thousands of American troops after the Philippines fell to Japanese forces in 1942 pointed to the unimaginable suffering that loomed for Connecticut servicemen.
I never thought I would live through it anyway, so it didn't bother me, because there was no chance. Most of my friends lost their life, so I figured I was the same as they would be. We never expected to come out of it at the end of the war.
Frank Jordan Jr., a 22-year-old prisoner of war from Norwich, perished in the Philippines on July 11, 1942. Within weeks of the loss of the Philippines, U.S. naval forces took to the offensive in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The American victory in early May 1942 stopped Japanese thrusts in the southern Pacific. In Connecticut, the mournful tableau that would bear down on the state without relief for the next 3 years took form. News of the first casualties of the major naval engagements reached home within days of the naval battles. After Coral Sea, U.S. forces won engagements at Midway Island and on Guadalcanal. But a thickening list of casualties became routine and included young conscripts and middle-aged career military men. 16-year-old Joseph Ara of New Britain lost his life on a Navy ship patrolling the waters of Guadalcanal on November 14, 1942. He was the state's youngest serviceman to die in action. 41-year-old Commander Howard Thomas Gracie of Meriden, aboard the USS Northampton, perished off Guadalcanal on November 30th after Japanese torpedoes struck the vessel. On November 8, 1942, the Allied Expeditionary Force opened its first challenge to Germany in North Africa. Casualties grew steadily as the battle moved inland. Seaman Walter Gorka, 19, of Windsor Locks, was one of the first casualties. He was killed in action off French Morocco shortly after the first assault troops landed. First Lieutenant Walter Arthur Carey, a 26-year-old Niantic resident, perished in Tunisia on December 4, 1942. 24-year-old Air Corps Captain Donald Hull Williams was killed in Algeria on January 6, 1943. He lived in Northford. Arthur Keefe, 28 years old, of Hebron, and Second Lieutenant William Johnson, 21, of Andover, also perished in the fighting. Corporal Joseph Smith, 23, was lost in Algeria on February 22, 1943. He was the first citizen of Deep River to die in action. In October 1942, the 8,000 Connecticut men of the 43rd Division, 169th Infantry Regiment left the United States to join the battle in the Southwest Pacific. Elements of the 169th Infantry landed on New Georgia Island between July 2nd and 6th, 1943. Japanese forces knew how to fight in the jungle. The 169th did not. Many combat deaths were blamed on inexperienced and incompetent officers, the lack of adequate training, and friendly fire from rifles and artillery.
Casualties, New Georgia Campaign, 18 July to 5 August 1943. Case 1, severe penetrating wounds of the entire body. The man was a truck driver in the forward vehicle advancing on the enemy-held Munda Trail. He was struck by .25 caliber light machine gun fire at a 60-yard range. Classified as KIA, died instantly. Case 3, severe perforating wound of the head. This man sat up in his foxhole while talking in his sleep during the early morning hours of July 19 and was shot by another soldier with an M1 rifle at the range of approximately 20 to 30 yards, classified as KIA. Case 106, moderately severe penetrating wound of the right leg. This man was on offensive action advancing toward the Japanese line in a crouched position when he was struck by an enemy light machine gun bullet at a 15-yard range. After this man received his wound, he became confused and crawled toward the enemy line. He was pulled into a Japanese foxhole, and when his body was recovered, it was found that he had been strangled to death by a rope. Classified as KIA.
Living in a foxhole made us psychic. You got to know what a man thought by the touch of his fingers in the dark. That famous third night on the drive to Munda was the worst. The Japs coming in within 25 feet, screeching, hollering all night, rolling their grenades. We couldn't talk. We couldn't move for the fear the creak of a knee would give us away. Every morning we were frozen. He left our helmet straps unhooked for good reason. That was after one of us was pulled out of his hole by his helmet, lifted by the strap under his chin. Frank Gilberto, 169th Infantry, Hartford.
The 169th Infantry and other regiments ultimately overcame Japanese resistance and secured the New Georgia Islands in early September. Dozens of Connecticut servicemen fell in the fighting, including 26-year-old Corporal Lino David Giron of Kensington. Giron organized and served as the first president of the Kensington Volunteer Fire Department before he left for war. He was killed on August 16, 1943, when he was hit by Japanese machine gun fire. The casualty list included Private Bernard Louis Adler, a Polish immigrant from Hartford who worked as a salesman. He died of wounds on August 22, 1943. Fatigue and the emotional distress of jungle fighting produced huge numbers of psychiatric casualties. The 169th Infantry contributed almost half of the 1,700 psychiatric cases reported by the 43rd Division in July of 1943. Doctors initially blamed traditional reasons, such as combat stress, for the caseload. But they ultimately found that poor morale triggered by questionable leadership served as the most important factor of all. In November, the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps landed on Bougainville in the Solomon Islands and took heavy casualties. Private Joseph Pansiera of Stafford Springs was wounded in the initial assault and died on November 5th. Another Connecticut man from a small town, 19-year-old Russell Friedrich of Andover, was killed the following month and buried in New Guinea. From 1942 until the end of the war, air squadrons piloted and crewed by men as young as 18 flew bombing raids over European cities. The death rate was high. The same held true in the Pacific theater of operations for air raids over the Japanese home islands. Marine aviator Horace Gillette Cleveland III, a 22-year-old pilot from Darien, perished in January 1943 in the Solomon Islands when his plane went down. Sergeant David Barker of Roxbury was ordered to bail out of his stricken plane over Germany on January 11, 1944. Crewmates later reported that the 20-year-old was last seen helping a mortally wounded gunner caught at his post. The official report of Barker's death stated that he went down with the plane. Staff Sergeant Charles Cogswell, 21 of Richfield, was killed in March of 1944 over the Adriatic Sea. Roy Eno, a 20-year-old staff sergeant from Hartford, was lost over Austria in July of 1944. First Lieutenant Roger Woodbury, a Hartford High teacher, was killed in February 1945 when his plane crashed into an Italian mountainside while he returned from a confidential mission.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Woodbury, it is with deep sorrow that I write this letter, hoping that in some small way it will give you some measure of comfort in your period of shock and suffering from the death of your son. I was fortunate in being Lieutenant Woodbury's commanding officer and knew him personally from the day that he reported to this organization. No words of mine can possibly be adequate to express our mutual loss, both personally and for my squadron. Your son died instantly when the plane on which he was a passenger crashed into a mountain and burst into flame. Death came so suddenly and unexpectedly that he could not possibly have felt the slightest pain. He was returning from an important confidential mission at the time of the accident. His services at all times were of the highest caliber. He is a loss which is surely felt by all members of this organization. Your son was buried with full military honors in a military cemetery in northern Italy. I, as well as many of his close friends, were present at the services, and you may rest assured that he had a complete Christian burial in all respects. The personal effects of your son have been checked and carefully packed and are being forwarded to the effects quartermaster, Kansas City, Missouri. Sincerely, Howard E. Mitchell, Captain Air Corps, commanding, February 10th, 1945.
I helped to bury 3,000 dead American soldiers in our cemetery at Cambridge, England. Besides that, I put up the little white wooden crosses for the graves. As I did, I noticed a lot of the boys were from Connecticut. When we started, there were only 50 graves in the cemetery, but it grew quite a bit as the war went on. Joseph Carr, Private, 3212 Quartermaster Service Company, New Haven.
The remains of American servicemen killed as battles raged were buried in temporary American military cemeteries in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Some cemeteries were large in scale and carefully engineered. Others were dug out of the moist soil deep in the jungle. Whenever possible, Graves registration soldiers documented and mapped the location of the remains. In that way, the remains could be identified and shipped home at the end of hostilities. The U.S. Navy buried its dead at sea. Sailors laboring deep within battleships, destroyers, and carriers faced threats they could not see or sense until hit by enemy fire. They had little defense against determined Japanese naval bombardment and kamikaze attacks. Seaman Second Class Ralph Charles Libero of New Haven was killed on December 13, 1944, during action off the Philippine Islands. He was 18. Under the sea, men feared depth charges launched from the surface and bombs from air patrols. Dozens of submarines were lost in battle. Connecticut felt these losses intimately, as submariners were often based in the New London Groton area. The vessels were built there as well by electric boat. The USS Barbell set out from New England on May 6, 1944 for the Pacific. Fire Control Man Julian Ruddick of Newington was aboard. The Barbell destroyed or damaged a dozen Japanese ships within the first 6 months at sea. On February 3, 1945, Japanese planes spotted the Barbell in the South China Sea and attacked. The ship and her crew, including Ruddick, were lost. 21-year-old Warren Thompson of North Haven and his 88 crewmates on the USS Trigger vanished off Guam in late March 1945. The ground war against Nazi Germany moved from North Africa to Italy in 1943. The ensuing Italian campaign turned out to be one of the costliest of the war. Casualties soared from Sicily to Anzio, and Connecticut infantry soldiers began dying in greater numbers than ever before. Private Frank Zisk of Bridgeport was killed on July 13, 1943 in Sicily. 23-year-old Staff Sergeant Robert Woods of Thompsonville lost his life there a day later. Connecticut suffered grievous losses at Anzio. Private First Class Charles Balfour of Kensington was killed February 16, 1944. He was 31. Private William Cassidy, 19, of Plainville, perished a day before Balfour. On March 2nd, 19-year-old Private Simone Giuliano of New Britain was killed. John Pardis of Torrington, 25, lost his life in May. The Testa family of Bristol, an immigrant family from Italy, sent 2 sons to fight in Europe. Philip Testa survived the invasions of North Africa and Sicily, but perished at Salerno in 1943. Rocco Testa lost his life in Anzio in January 1944. Several Connecticut families suffered similar fates. The fear of losing sons in battle consumed the daily lives of Connecticut parents.
Dear Governor, I would like to thank you for the lovely letter of sympathy received concerning the death of my son, Private Herbert E. Hagenstein, who was killed in France August 10, 1944. I would like to ask you, as a broken-hearted mother, if there was any possible chance of saving my youngest son of going overseas, Staff Sergeant Herman A. Hagenstein, 110-64895, who is in the 89th Chemical Composite Company, APO 17558, San Francisco, California. He has had 2 years of service, which he has lost the hearing in one ear, has had pneumonia twice. He hasn't told his commanding officer that he can't hear, as he is one that wouldn't try to get out of going over and would be very angry at me for even writing to you and trying to save him from going over. Governor Baldwin, is there any chance of him staying on this side and doing all he can? Please don't think me unpatriotic or selfish, and hoping you understand. Yours very sincerely, Mrs. A. Hagenstein Hoffman, 367 Elm Street, New Haven, November 20th, 1944.
The fighting in Italy combined with invasion planning for France to take more men from their homes in Connecticut. The Normandy Campaign ran from June 6th to July 24th, 1944. It cost the Army 63,360 battle casualties, including dozens of Connecticut men killed during D-Day landings at Normandy in France. Among the dead of June 6, 1944, was Army Private Guillaume Bedard of New London. His father, Hormides, had died of illness while on duty with the Navy in Australia 8 months earlier. Private Robert Ditmar, 19, of Fairfield, and Private Douglas Osborne of Windsor were both killed on Omaha Beach on June 6th. Sergeant Leslie Lewis of Hampton was killed on Omaha Beach and later buried at the U.S. Military Cemetery No. 1 in Saint-Laurent, France. Private First Class Michael Detzko of Ansonia, 25, died of wounds he received in action on June 6th at Utah Beach. First Lieutenant Bernard Bussier of Hartford joined the Normandy battle with elements of the 101st Airborne on June 7th. Before military service, he worked as the golf professional at the Wethersfield Country Club. He died on the second day of fighting. Once troops breached Nazi defenses and moved inland, artillery attacks and the stress of daily combat sent the psychiatric toll soaring.
The key to an understanding of the psychiatric problem is the simple fact that danger of being killed imposes a strain so great that it causes men to break down. This fact is frequently not appreciated and cannot be fully understood until one has either seen psychiatric cases just out of the lines or himself has actually been exposed to bombing, shell, and mortar fire. One look at the shrunken, apathetic faces of psychiatric patients as they come stumbling into the medical station, sobbing, trembling, referring shuddering to them shells and to buddies mutilated or dead is enough to convince most observers. Anyone entering the combat zone undergoes a profound emotional change which cannot be described. Each man up there knows that at any moment he may be killed, a fact kept constantly before his mind by the sight of dead and mutilated buddies around him. To one who has been up there, it is obvious that there's no such thing as getting used to combat. Each moment of it imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their exposure. Colonel Robert S. Anderson, Medical Corps, Editor-in-Chief, Neuropsychiatry in World War II.
The final advance toward Germany opened in September 1944 and turned out to be the costliest campaign of the war in Europe. During the 8 months of combat in the Rhineland, American forces absorbed 240,000 casualties. Almost 51,000 men were killed in action. Hundreds of Connecticut men, including fathers who had been in service for less than a year, could be found on casualty lists. 25-year-old Captain Donald Donahue of Stamford was killed in action on November 11, 1944 in France. He left behind 2 children, Frederick and Mary Patricia. Private Harry Hubble left Waterbury and his 2-year-old son to join the battle in Europe. He was killed at Bruckhausen, Germany on March 10, 1945. The action also claimed Captain Ernest D. Clark, Jr. of Hartford. Clark, an attorney with Robinson, Robinson & Cole before the war, served as a battery commander. He was wounded on November 3, 1944 in the Hürtgen Forest and died a day later. By October 1944, the wartime pressures seemed ready to be relieved. To boost morale during the drive toward Berlin, the War Department produced a Christmas special in London for distribution to Allied forces. The Germans counterattacked across the Belgian frontier before the troops could see it. All talk of an end to the war by Christmas ceased.
And now here's a very good friend of mine, someone who would also like to be part of your Christmas. One of the great women of our times, Miss Marian Anderson.
The Battle of the Bulge took the lives of dozens of Connecticut men. Sergeant Donald Parker, Jr., a 24-year-old member of the 9th Armored Division from Wallingford, was killed in action on December 29, 1944. First Lieutenant William Burwell of New Haven, a member of the 13th Airborne, perished in Belgium on January 3, 1945. Private James Logan of Norwalk, a 20-year-old paratrooper, lost his life 4 days later, also in Belgium. Private Dominic DeLuca of Bridgeport lost his life in the opening week of the last year of the war. He was killed in action on January 6, 1945, in France. In Alsace, France, 18-year-old Private Harold M. Volette of Vollentown was last seen 50 yards off an enemy-held position. He was never seen again and declared dead in late January 1945. As American forces pressed on in the Pacific, casualties increased. The Japanese fought fiercely, knowing they would not be reinforced or relieved. On Leyte in the Philippines, the oldest state combatant to fall in the war was killed. Dr. M.F. Morgan, 49, served as the chief soil scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Experimental Station in New Haven. Japanese troops ambushed a convoy led by Morgan in January 1945. Morgan was killed in action and buried in the 77th Division Cemetery. The island campaigns of the Pacific claimed Connecticut men in great numbers. The combat on Guam underscored the difficulty of dislodging Japanese combat units from the island chains leading to Tokyo. On Guam, Private First Class Virginio Araujo, Jr. of the 3rd Marine Division was killed on July 26, 1944. The Windsor man was 19. In February and March of 1945, the assault and subsequent victory on Iwo Jima claimed the lives of many Connecticut men. "18-year-old Private John Gardner of West Hartford was killed in action on February 19, 1945. Private First Class Ludwig Halles of Danbury died of wounds on March 2, 1945. He was 25. 19-year-old Richard von Egedy of Stamford was killed in action on March 3rd. Marvin Tinker, an 18-year-old private from Niantic, perished on March 8th. Private Odell Doyon of Griswold originally served in the Maritime Service, but was anxious for combat. The Marines turned down his enlistment application twice, before accepting it in July 1944, as the need for men far outstripped supply. 8 months after enlisting, Doyon was killed in his first battle of the war. Pharmacist mate Robert Krosky of Trumbull, 21, was killed in action on March 18th. The bloody Okinawa campaign that followed Iwo Jima furnished ample evidence of the high cost an invasion of the Japanese homeland would extract. Victory came only after thousands of deaths. Sergeant Francis Boniface Zabrowski, 22 of Bristol, was killed in action on April 26, 1945. Marine Private First Class Aubrey Hall, Jr., a 21-year-old from Bridgeport, was killed on May 5th. While the fighting raged in the Pacific, Allied troops finally breached stubborn German defenses. Still, the infantry needed to absorb many casualties before the Germans would surrender. Private First Class Leroy Frank Miller of New Haven died of wounds he received in the fighting at Warburg, Germany. He was 27. Less than 3 weeks before the end of the hostilities in Germany, 18-year-old Thomas Handley from East Haven perished in the fierce battle for Nuremberg. Armored and infantry columns liberated thousands of Allied prisoners of war during the advance toward Berlin. Many POWs suffered from disease and hunger. The war in Europe ended on May 5, 1945. Imperial Japan continued to fight in the Pacific, despite fierce air raids from B-29s over the home islands. Sergeant Donald L. Schubert of Westbrook was shot down over Tokyo in April of 1945. Schubert and another Connecticut man, Sergeant Donald McNiven of Waterbury, bailed out of their B-29 and survived, but Japanese forces captured the pair. On May 26, 1945, Schubert and McNiven were killed when American bombers launched a fire raid that consumed their prison cells in Tokyo. In July 1945, the USS Indianapolis began its return to the United States after delivering the atomic bomb to Tinian. A Japanese submarine torpedoed the vessel on July 29th, sinking her. All but 500 crew members perished. 20-year-old Seaman First Class Clarence Hicks of Enfield was killed. Robert Keeney of Wethersfield also lost his life.
It's impossible to really bring full comfort. You just had to suffer with them. Now, most of them were fairly new to me yet, but nevertheless, you have to sit with them and weep with them and hear their stories and help them get through it somehow.
After the atomic bomb attacks of August 6th and 8th, the Japanese surrendered, ending the Second World War. 8 days after the war ended, on a quiet farm outside Waterbury, a 20-year-old University of Connecticut student was killed. Alice Stevens was driving a truck on the farm when it overturned. She was a member of the Women's Land Army and helped to feed Connecticut during the dangerous food shortages of the war. Now, she became the one casualty of the war whose death went largely unnoticed outside the circle of friends and family. The search for the dead went on for years after the war. Some bodies were never recovered. Others were found entombed within the machines of war. More than half of Connecticut's war dead were interred in military cemeteries in Asia and Europe, buried at sea, or never recovered. The rest, some 2,000 in all, were returned to their hometowns. They are remembered with American flags carefully placed on their graves each Memorial Day.
Thucydides, a funeral oration by Pericles. They gave her their lives, to her and to all of us, and for their own selves they won praises that never grow old, the most splendid of sepulchres. Not the sepulchre in which their bodies are laid, but where their glory remains eternal in men's minds, always there on the right occasion to stir others to speech or to action. For famous men have the whole earth as their memorial. It is not only the inscriptions on their graves in their own country that mark them out. No, in foreign lands also, not in any visible form, but in people's hearts, their memory abides and grows. It is for you to try to be like them. Make up your minds that happiness depends on being free, and freedom depends on being courageous.